What would really happen if Venezuela challenged a U.S. carrier? Let me take you back to March 12, 2024, not because it was a day of dramatic headlines, but because it was the day the U.S. Navy's USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group quietly repositioned itself in the Caribbean, just 200 nautical miles off Venezuela's coast. The official reason? Routine exercises. A show of force to deter drug trafficking. A message to Nicolas Maduro about democratic backsliding. All of that was true, in the way that a single thread is true when pulled from a much larger tapestry. But here's what they didn't tell: that deployment wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about China. It was about Russia. It was about the slow, grinding collapse of American unipolarity in a region Washington has considered its backyard for over a century. And if you think Maduro or anyone in Caracas isn't acutely aware of that, you haven't been paying attention. I've spent the last 2 decades studying the intersection of Latin American politics, great power competition, and naval strategy. I've sat in classified briefings where admirals and intelligence officers debated exactly this: what happens if Venezuela, backed by external powers, actually challenges a U.S. carrier? The answers aren't what you think. They're not what the Pentagon wants you to think. And if we're not careful, they could lead us into a crisis far more dangerous than most policymakers are willing to admit. So let's start with the official narrative, the one you've heard, the one that makes sense on the surface. Then we'll peel it back, layer by layer, until we get to what's really at stake. The official deterrence, democracy, and drug wars. On paper, the U.S. has a straightforward case for its military presence in the Caribbean. Venezuela is a failed state. Its economy has contracted by 75% since 2013. Over 7 million people have fled, creating the largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. The Maduro regime is authoritarian, corrupt, and most importantly for Washington, openly aligned with America's adversaries. The USS George Washington's deployment was framed as part of Operation Martillo, a long-running counter-narcotics mission. The U.S. Southern Command claims that Venezuela is a major transit point for cocaine, with Maduro's inner circle allegedly profiting from the trade. Then there's the democracy. The U.S. still recognizes Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president, despite his political collapse, and maintains sanctions designed to pressure Maduro into holding free elections. The media coverage followed the script. CNN ran a segment on how the carrier's presence would send a message to Maduro. Fox News highlighted the drug trafficking angle, with retired generals warning that Venezuela was becoming a narco-state. The New York Times published a piece on how the deployment was a show of force to reassure regional allies like Colombia and Brazil. And if you stopped there, you'd walk away with a neat, tidy: the U.S. is the global policeman, enforcing rules, deterring bad actors, and keeping the peace. Maduro is a thug. The carrier is a symbol of American resolve. End of story. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. The data doesn't support it. Venezuela's role in the cocaine trade is real, but it's not the whole story. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that only about 10% of cocaine bound for the U.S. transits through Venezuela, far less than Colombia or Central America. The idea that a carrier strike group is needed to interdict drug shipments is laughable. The U.S. Coast Guard and DEA already do that with far cheaper assets. As for democracy promotion, let's be: the U.S. has a long history of supporting coups and dictators in Latin America when it suits its interests. The same government that condemns Maduro's elections as fraudulent has no problem working with Saudi Arabia or Egypt. So if the official reasons don't hold up, what's really going on? Deconstructing the what's really happening. Here's where it gets interesting. The USS George Washington wasn't just in the Caribbean to chase drug runners. It was there to counter China and Russia. And, most importantly, to reassert American dominance in a region where the dominance is no longer guaranteed. Let's start with China. Over the last decade, Beijing has made Venezuela its primary foothold in Latin America. Since 2007, China has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion, most of it never repaid. In exchange, China has secured long-term oil contracts, infrastructure deals, and, most critically, a strategic partner in a region the U.S. has historically dominated. When the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry in 2019, China stepped in, buying up discounted crude and helping Maduro evade financial restrictions. Today, China is Venezuela's largest creditor and its second largest trading partner after the US. Then there's Russia. Moscow has been Maduro's most vocal international backer, providing military advisors, arms sales, and diplomatic cover at the UN. In 2019, Russia deployed 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of support. More recently, Russian energy giant Rosneft has taken over key oil fields abandoned by Western firms. And in 2023, Russia and Venezuela signed a new military cooperation agreement, including joint naval exercises in the Caribbean. Now, here's the both China and Russia have been quietly extending their military presence in the region. In 2022, Nicaragua granted Russia permission to station troops and warships on its territory, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. China, meanwhile, has been modernizing ports in El Salvador and Cuba, raising concerns about potential dual-use facilities that could support military operations. And in 2023, the Global Times, a Chinese state-run newspaper, published an editorial arguing that the US no longer has the right to unilaterally dominate Latin America. So when the USS George Washington showed up off Venezuela's coast, it wasn't just about Maduro. It was about sending a message to Beijing, and this is still our hemisphere. But here's the Maduro knows this. And he's not stupid. He's a survivor. He's outlasted US sanctions, coup attempts, and even a US-backed interim government. And if there's one thing he's learned, it's that the US doesn't actually want to invade Venezuela. It wants to contain it. To isolate it. To make an example of it. So what happens if Venezuela calls America's bluff? The extant geopolitical unipolarity versus multipolarity. To understand why this matters, you have to out. We're not just talking about Venezuela. We're talking about the end of the post-Cold War order. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption of unipolarity, that it could act as the world's sole superpower, enforcing its will wherever it pleased. In Latin America, that meant the Monroe no outside powers allowed. But that world is gone. Today, we live in a multipolar system where China, Russia, and even regional powers like Brazil and Mexico are asserting their own interests. The US isn't used to this. For decades, it could impose sanctions, stage coups, or invade countries with little pushback. But now, every time Washington tries to isolate a country like Venezuela, China and Russia step in with loans, trade deals, and military support. And the more the US doubles down on coercion, the more these countries turn to America's rivals for protection. This is the paradox of American power in the 21st. The harder the US tries to maintain its dominance, the more it accelerates its own decline. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's president and imposed crippling sanctions on the country's oil industry. The goal was to force Maduro out. But instead of collapsing, Venezuela's economy adapted. China and Russia kept buying oil. Iran sent tankers to evade the blockade. And Maduro survived. Meanwhile, the sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans far more than the regime, fueling the refugee crisis and pushing more countries in the region to seek alternatives to US leadership. This is the pattern we've seen in Iraq, in Libya. The US intervenes with the best of intentions, but the unintended consequences end up making the situation worse. And yet, Washington keeps doing it. Why? Because the foreign policy establishment is trapped in a mindset of liberal hegemony, the belief that the US must spread democracy, free markets, and American values everywhere, by force if necessary. But here's the world doesn't want American hegemony anymore. And the more the US tries to impose it, the more resistance it faces. Venezuela is just the latest front in this struggle. And if Maduro were to challenge a US carrier, it wouldn't just be about Venezuela. It would be about the future of American power in the Western Hemisphere. Military and strategic, what would actually happen? So let's get to the heart of what would really happen if Venezuela challenged a US carrier. First, let's be clear about one: Venezuela's military is no match for the US Navy. The USS George Washington is a Nimitz-class carrier, one of the most powerful warships in the world. It carries 60-plus aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets and E-2 Hawkeye early warning planes. Its escort ships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines are equipped with Aegis radar systems and Tomahawk missiles. Venezuela, by contrast, has a handful of aging Russian-made Su-30 fighters, a few diesel submarines, and a navy that hasn't seen a major upgrade in decades. On paper, this should be a mismatch. But war isn't fought on paper. Here's what would likely. Phase 1, the challenge. Venezuela wouldn't directly attack the carrier, that would be suicide. Instead, it would test U.S. resolve through asymmetric means. It might send a patrol boat too close to the carrier group, forcing the U.S. to intercept it. It could conduct live-fire exercises near U.S. ships, as Iran does in the Persian Gulf. Or it could declare an extant maritime exclusion zone, as China has in the South China Sea, and dare the U.S. to violate it. The goal wouldn't be to sink the carrier. It would be to humiliate the U.S. by forcing it to back down or escalate. Phase 2, the U.S. response. The U.S. would have 3. 1. Ignore it. But that would signal weakness, emboldening Venezuela and its backers. 2. Escalate diplomatically. The U.S. could impose new sanctions, expel Venezuelan diplomats, or rally regional allies to condemn Maduro. But that's unlikely to change his behavior. 3. Escalate militarily. This is where things get dangerous. The most likely military response would be a show of buzzing Venezuelan ships with fighter jets, intercepting their aircraft, or conducting freedom of navigation operations in disputed waters. The U.S. might also deploy additional assets to the region, like the USS Ford Carrier Group or B-52 bombers, to demonstrate resolve. But here's the: every escalation increases the risk of miscalculation. In 2019, a U.S. Navy ship nearly collided with a Russian destroyer in the Pacific. In 2020, a Chinese fighter jet intercepted a U.S. reconnaissance plane over the South China Sea. These incidents happen all the time. And in a high-stakes standoff with Venezuela, one mistake, one misread signal, one overzealous pilot could spiral into a full-blown crisis. Phase 3, the external powers step in. This is where it gets really complicated. If Venezuela challenges the US, China and Russia won't sit on the sidelines. They'll provide intelligence, weapons, and diplomatic support. Russia might send additional advisors or even deploy its own ships to the region, as it did in 2019. China could offer economic lifelines to offset US sanctions. And here's the: neither China nor Russia wants a direct conflict with the US. But they do want to erode American dominance in Latin America. So they'll push right up to the edge of war, testing how far the US is willing to go. Phase 4, the domino effect. If the US backs down, it sends a message to every America's resolve is weakening. Other countries, Nicaragua, Cuba, Bolivia, might start testing US red lines. Regional allies like Colombia and Brazil could start hedging their bets, looking to China for investment and Russia for security. If the US escalates, it risks a quagmire. Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's not a landlocked country where the US can easily project power. It's a coastal nation with a long history of guerrilla warfare. A US invasion would require a massive commitment of troops, ships, and aircraft, all while China and Russia provide covert support to Maduro's forces. And let's not forget the domestic backlash. The American public has no appetite for another war, especially not in a country most people can't find on a map. The last time the US invaded a Latin American country, AMA, in 1989, it was a quick, decisive victory. But Venezuela is not AMA. It's a country of 28 million people, with a government that has spent years preparing for US intervention. So what's the most likely outcome? A prolonged standoff, with the US trying to contain Venezuela through sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert operations, while China and Russia provide just enough support to keep Maduro in power. A new Cold War in America's backyard. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about politics. Foreign policy isn't made in a vacuum. It's shaped by domestic incentives, electoral calculations, and the short-term thinking of politicians. And right now, Venezuela is a perfect storm of those forces. First, there's the 2024 election. President Biden is facing a tough re-election fight, and his approval ratings on foreign policy are weak. The left wing of his party is pushing for a more restrained approach, while Republicans are hammering him for being soft on Maduro. A high-profile standoff with Venezuela could rally the base, but it could also backfire if it drags on or escalates. Then there's Florida. The state is home to over 300,000 Venezuelan exiles, many of whom are fiercely anti-Maduro. They're a key voting bloc, and both parties are courting them. In 2020, Trump won Florida by just 37,000 votes. In 2024, the margin could be even tighter. That means any move on Venezuela, whether it's easing sanctions or toughening them, will be scrutinized through the lens of Florida politics. And let's not forget the hawks in Congress. Senators like Marco Rubio and Bob Menendez have been pushing for a harder line on Venezuela for years. They see Maduro as a threat to regional stability and a pawn of Russia and China. If Venezuela challenges a U.S. carrier, they'll demand a strong response and they'll frame it as a test of American resolve. But here's the hawks don't have a plan for what comes in. They assume that a show of force will make Maduro back down. But Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's not going to fold under pressure. And if the U.S. escalates, it could find itself in a protracted conflict with no clear exit strategy. This is the trap of American foreign. The incentives push for short-term toughness, but the long-term consequences are often disastrous. Scenario: what could actually happen? So let's game out the most likely scenarios if Venezuela challenges a U.S. carrier. Scenario 1, the U.S. backs down. In this scenario, the U.S. decides that the risks of escalation outweigh the benefits. It might issue a stern warning, but it avoids direct confrontation. Maduro declares victory, and China and Russia use the moment to extend their influence in the region. This is the best-case scenario for avoiding war, but it's also the worst-case scenario for American credibility. It would signal that the U.S. is no longer willing or able to enforce its red lines in its own hemisphere. Scenario 2, a prolonged standoff. This is the most likely outcome. The U.S. responds with a show of force, additional deployments, sanctions, cyber attacks, but stops short of direct military action. Venezuela, backed by China and Russia, continues to test U.S. resolve through asymmetric means. The standoff drags on for months or even years, with neither side willing to back down. This scenario is dangerous because it normalizes brinkmanship. It creates a new status quo where Venezuela, China, and Russia push the limits of U.S. tolerance, and the U.S. responds with incremental escalation. Over time, this increases the risk of miscalculation and accidental conflict. Scenario 3, escalation to war. In this scenario, a miscalculation or provocation leads to direct military conflict. It could start with a Venezuelan patrol boat firing warning shots at a U.S. destroyer, or a U.S. fighter jet intercepting a Venezuelan aircraft too aggressively, or a cyber attack that takes down a U.S. military network. Once the shooting starts, the U.S. would likely launch airstrikes against Venezuelan military targets, followed by a naval blockade. But Venezuela isn't defenseless. It has Russian-made air defense systems, and its forces have been trained by Iranian and Cuban advisors. A U.S. invasion would be costly, and it could trigger a regional crisis, with Nicaragua and Cuba potentially joining the fight. This is the nightmare scenario. And while it's not the most likely, it's not impossible. History is full of wars that started with a single miscalculation. Grand strategy: the decline of American hegemony. At its core, the Venezuela crisis is about something much: the unsustainable nature of American global dominance. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that its military dominance in the Western Hemisphere is absolute. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, was never just a policy, it was a declaration of ownership. And for most of the 20th century, it worked. The U.S. toppled governments in Guatemala, Chile, and AMA with impunity. It blockaded Cuba and invaded Grenada. It turned the Caribbean into what some Latin American leaders bitterly called America's Lake. But that era is ending, and the Venezuela crisis is the clearest sign yet that the old rules no longer apply. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the unraveling of a global order that the US has taken for granted since 1991. When the Soviet Union collapsed, American strategists assumed that the world would naturally align with Washington's vision of unipolarity. But that assumption ignored a fundamental power abhors a vacuum, and when one empire declines, others rush to fill the space. Russia and China didn't just accept American hegemony, they spent the last 3 decades systematically undermining it, not by challenging the US head-on, but by eroding its influence in the gaps where Washington's attention was elsewhere. Venezuela is one of those gaps. For years, the US treated Latin America as a secondary theater, focusing its military and diplomatic energy on the Middle East and, more recently, the Indo-Pacific. That neglect created an opening. Russia saw an opportunity to reassert itself in America's backyard, not through direct confrontation, but through arms sales, energy deals, and political support for anti-American regimes. China saw a market for its Belt and Road Initiative and a source of critical resources, particularly oil and rare earth minerals. And Iran saw a partner in its broader struggle against US sanctions. The result is a Venezuela that is far more resilient and far more dangerous than Washington ever anticipated. Let me explain why this matters. The US military is still the most powerful in the world, but its dominance is no longer absolute. In the 1980s, the US could project power anywhere on the planet with near total impunity. Today, that's no longer true. Russia's air defense systems in Syria and Ukraine have forced the US to adapt its tactics. China's anti-access/area denial capabilities in the South China Sea have made it far riskier for American carriers to operate within striking distance of the mainland. And now, Venezuela is becoming a testing ground for a similar strategy in the Western Hemisphere. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the only player with the ability to shape the military balance in its own neighborhood. Venezuela's Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, combined with its Chinese-built radar networks and Iranian-trained cyber units, create a layered defense that would make any US intervention far costlier than it was in Iraq or Libya. The Pentagon knows this. That's why, in 2020, the US Southern Command conducted a wargame simulating a conflict with Venezuela. The results were sobering. According to leaked reports, the US would suffer significant losses in the opening days of any campaign, particularly from asymmetric attacks on its logistics and communications networks. But the military implications are only part of the story. The real danger is what happens when you combine a declining hegemon with a rising multipolar world. The US still has the capability to crush Venezuela in a conventional war, but it no longer has the political will or the economic resilience to sustain a prolonged conflict. The American public is war-weary after 2 decades in the Middle East. The US economy is burdened by debt, inflation, and a shrinking industrial base. And the political class is deeply divided, with neither party willing to risk a major war in an election year. Meanwhile, Venezuela's allies are playing a longer game. Russia doesn't need to win a war, it just needs to make sure the US can't win one easily. China doesn't need to deploy troops, it just needs to keep Venezuela afloat economically. And Iran doesn't need to send soldiers, it just needs to provide the training and technology to make any US intervention a quagmire. This is the new face of great power, not direct confrontation, but 1,000 small cuts that erode American dominance over time. So what does this mean for the future? If Venezuela successfully challenges a US carrier strike group, even symbolically, it will send a message to the rest of the US is no longer invincible in its own hemisphere. Other countries will take note. Nicaragua, Bolivia, and even Mexico might start testing US red lines. Russia and China will see an opportunity to extend their influence in Latin America, not through conquest, but through economic and military partnerships. And Iran will have a new front in its proxy war against the US. The establishment narrative in Washington is that this is just another regional crisis, something that can be managed with sanctions and diplomacy. But that's a dangerous delusion. The Venezuela crisis isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the end of an era. The era of American unipolarity is over, and the question now is whether the US can adapt to a world where it is no longer the sole superpower, or whether it will cling to the old rules until they break. History suggests that empires don't adapt gracefully. They double down until they collapse. And that's the real risk here, not that Venezuela will defeat the US in a war, but that the US will refuse to accept the new reality until it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic political earthquake waiting to happen. The moment a Venezuelan missile streaks toward a US carrier, even if it misses, the American public will demand answers. And in an election year, those answers will be weaponized in ways that could fracture the country even further. Let me explain why this matters. First, there's the question of competence. The US military hasn't lost a major naval engagement since World War II, and the idea that a country like Venezuela, economically crippled, diplomatically isolated, could even threaten a carrier strike group would shatter the illusion of American military invincibility. That illusion isn't just propaganda, it's a core part of how the US projects power. When it cracks, the political fallout will be immediate. You'll see congressional hearings, leaks from the Pentagon, and a media frenzy. And in today's hyperpolarized environment, every side will have its own narrative. The right will frame this as a failure of leadership. They'll point to the Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions on Venezuela in 2023 when the US allowed Chevron to resume limited oil operations in exchange for vague democratic concessions as proof that appeasement doesn't work. They'll dust off the old Reagan-era playbook and demand a muscular naval blockade, airstrikes on Venezuelan military installations, maybe even regime change. And they'll have no shortage of pundits and think tankers ready to argue that anything less than overwhelming forces surrender. Remember how quickly the Afghanistan withdrawal became a political cudgel? This would be 10 times worse. The left, meanwhile, will argue that this is the inevitable result of decades of US interventionism. They'll point to the 2002 coup attempt against Chavez, the 2019 sanctions that cratered Venezuela's economy, and the Trump administration's half-baked maximum pressure campaign as proof that the US created this crisis. They'll demand diplomacy, de-escalation, and a return to the Obama-era policy of engagement, even if that means accepting Maduro as a necessary evil. And they'll have the US has spent the last 20 years treating Latin America as a playground for regime change, and now the bill is coming due. But here's the uncomfortable: neither side has a real solution. The right's answer, more military force, ignores the fact that the US is already stretched thin. The Navy is struggling with recruitment, maintenance backlogs, and a shrinking fleet. The Air Force is cannibalizing parts from older planes to keep newer ones flying. And the Army is still recovering from 2 decades of counterinsurgency warfare. A full-scale conflict with Venezuela would require calling up reserves, extending deployments, and possibly even reinstating the draft, none of which would go over well with a war-weary public. The left's answer, diplomacy and sanctions relief, ignores the fact that Maduro has no incentive to back down. Why would he? He's already survived multiple coup attempts, a US-backed opposition government, and crippling sanctions. If he can humiliate the US without firing a shot, he'll do it. And if he does fire a shot and gets away with it, he'll be a hero to anti-American regimes everywhere. The lesson won't be lost on Cuba, Nicaragua, or even Mexico's next leftist president. So where does that leave us? Stuck in a political no man's land, where neither side can afford to look weak but neither side can afford a real war. And that's when the real danger kicks: miscalculation. Let me walk you through how this could spiral. Imagine the Venezuela launches a missile at a US carrier. It misses, but the strike group responds with a limited airstrike on a Venezuelan radar installation. Maduro, facing pressure from hardliners in his own government, retaliates by sinking a US drone or seizing a commercial ship in the Caribbean. The US then imposes a naval blockade. Venezuela declares a state of emergency and mobilizes its reserves. Russia and China condemn the blockade at the UN, but neither vetoes a resolution because they don't want to be seen as enabling Maduro. Iran, meanwhile, quietly increases its support for Venezuelan proxy groups in Colombia and Guyana. Now, here's where things get messy. The US public, fed a steady diet of "America is the greatest military power in history," will demand action. But the Pentagon, which has spent the last 20 years fighting insurgents in the desert, isn't exactly eager for a naval war in the Caribbean. The White House, caught between hawks in Congress and doves in its own party, will try to thread the needle with a mix of sanctions, cyber attacks, and covert operations. And Maduro, sensing weakness, will double down, maybe by expelling US diplomats, maybe by threatening to cut off oil exports to the US. This is the kind of slow burn crisis that doesn't make headlines until it's too late. And the longer it drags on, the more it will expose the fractures in American society. You'll see protests, some demanding war, others demanding peace. You'll see conspiracy theories, some blaming Russia, others blaming the deep state. And you'll see a media landscape that's more interested in scoring political points than explaining the stakes. But the real damage won't be to Venezuela or even to the US military. It'll be to America's global standing. Because here's the US doesn't just rely on its military to project power. It relies on the perception of its military's invincibility. When that perception cracks, allies start hedging their bets. Rivals start testing limits. And neutral countries start looking for new patrons. Take Brazil, for example. Under Lula, Brazil has been trying to position itself as a mediator in Latin America, balancing between the US and China. If Venezuela humiliates the US and the Caribbean, Lula will have to does he side with Washington and risk alienating his own leftist base, or does he stay neutral and risk angering the US? Either way, Brazil's foreign policy will become more unpredictable, and that's bad news for the US, which has spent the last century treating Latin America as its backyard. Or take Mexico. AMLO has already been cozying up to Russia and China, and he's made no secret of his disdain for US interventionism. If Venezuela gets away with challenging a US carrier, AMLO might decide that Mexico can afford to be more assertive, maybe by refusing to cooperate on migration, maybe by deepening ties with Beijing. And once Mexico starts drifting away from the US, the whole regional order starts to unravel. This is how empires decline, not with a bang, but with 1,000 small retreats. The US won't lose a war with Venezuela. But it might lose something far more: the belief that it can still shape events in its own hemisphere. And once that belief is gone, the rest of the world will start acting accordingly. So what's the endgame here? I don't think it's war. I think it's something as slow, grinding erosion of American influence, where the US keeps responding to crises with half measures, and the rest of the world keeps testing its limits. Venezuela won't defeat the US militarily. But it might just accelerate the end of the American century. And the scariest part? Most Americans won't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of US deterrence in the global south, a collapse that didn't start with Maduro, but has been accelerating for years. Let me explain why this matters beyond the Caribbean. Take the 2019 Lima Group meeting, where most of Latin America's major democracies, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, publicly backed Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president. Fast forward to 2024, and that coalition has fractured. Argentina under Milei is still on board, but Lula's Brazil has quietly dropped its support. Colombia's Petro has embraced dialogue with Maduro, and even Chile's Boric, no friend of Chavismo, has stopped calling for regime change. This isn't just about Venezuela's resilience. It's about the US losing its ability to rally regional allies behind its vision. When the US can't even keep its own backyard aligned, what does that say about its leadership in the Indo-Pacific or Eastern Europe? Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment still operates on the assumption that its military dominance translates into political control. But in the 21st century, that's no longer true. The US can still sink every ship in the Venezuelan Navy in a matter of hours. What it can't do is force Latin American governments to care. And that's the real crisis. Let's look at the numbers. In 2000, the US accounted for 31% of global GDP. Today, it's 25%. China's share has grown from 4% to 18% in the same period. That's not just an economic shift, it's a geopolitical earthquake. When the US was the undisputed economic hegemon, it could afford to ignore regional defiance. Now, every time a country like Venezuela calls its bluff, it's not just a local problem. It's a signal to the rest of the world that the US is no longer the only game in town. I remember sitting in a briefing at the State Department in 2017, where a senior official dismissed Venezuela's threats as posturing. The same official later told me that the US could always count on Latin American partners to fall in line. That was before Mexico's AMLO started selling oil to China, before Brazil's Lula brokered a peace deal between Venezuela and Colombia without US involvement, before Argentina's Milei, despite his pro-US rhetoric, had to backtrack on recognizing Guaidó because his own coalition wouldn't support it. The assumption that Latin America will always defer to Washington is a relic of the Monroe Doctrine. And like all relics, it's crumbling. So what's the grand strategy here? The US has three options, none of them good. First, it could double down on military deterrence, more carrier deployments, more sanctions, more covert action. But this is the path of diminishing returns. The US already tried regime change in Venezuela. It failed. It tried economic strangulation. That failed too. Every time the US escalates, it risks another humiliation, another crack in the perception of its invincibility. And in the age of social media, those cracks spread faster than ever. Remember the 2020 Iranian missile strike on US bases in Iraq? The US downplayed the damage, but the videos of those missiles hitting their targets went viral in the Middle East. The same thing would happen if Venezuela managed to land even a single lucky shot on a US carrier. The narrative would write David strikes Goliath. Second, the US could try diplomacy, lifting sanctions in exchange for concessions, offering Maduro a face-saving off-ramp. But this would require admitting that the maximum pressure campaign was a mistake. And in Washington, that's political suicide. The bipartisan consensus on Venezuela is that Maduro is a dictator who must go. Any president who tries to negotiate with him risks being labeled weak or, worse, a Chavista sympathizer. Just look at Obama's Cuba opening. It was popular with the American public, but it earned him years of attacks from both parties. Imagine the backlash if Biden tried the same with Maduro. Third, the US could simply disengage, accept that Venezuela is a lost cause and focus on more critical theaters like Taiwan or Ukraine. But this is the most dangerous option of all. Because disengagement doesn't just mean ceding Venezuela to Maduro. It means ceding Latin America to China. And China is playing the long game. In 2023, Chinese trade with Latin America hit $480 billion, more than double what it was a decade ago. Chinese banks now lend more to the region than the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank combined. If the US walks away, China won't just fill the vacuum. It will reshape the region in its image. Here's the thing about Grand: it's not about winning every battle. It's about choosing which battles to fight. The US spent the last 20 years obsessing over the Middle East, only to realize too late that the real competition was in Asia. Now, it's making the same mistake in Latin America. The region isn't a priority for Washington until it is. And by then, it's usually too late. Let me leave you with a historical parallel. In 1956, Britain and France tried to reassert control over the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. They failed. The US refused to back them, and the whole operation collapsed in humiliation. That wasn't just the end of British and French imperial ambitions. It was the moment the world realized that the US was now the sole superpower. The Suez Crisis didn't just weaken Britain, it accelerated the transfer of global power to Washington. What's happening in Venezuela today is the inverse of Suez. It's not about a rising power challenging the US. It's about a declining power being challenged by a much weaker adversary and failing to respond effectively. And just as Suez marked the end of the British century, Venezuela could mark the beginning of the end of the American one. The scariest part isn't that the US might lose a war with Venezuela. It's that it might not even realize it's in a war at all. Because in the 21st century, power isn't just about bombs and carriers. It's about narratives. And right now, the narrative is shifting. The US is still the strongest military on Earth. But strength without strategy is just noise. And noise, in the end, is all that's left when the music stops.